Welcome back. This is Shah. Today we have a special guest, Dr. Stephen K. Baskerville. He is an American author and political theorist, previously an associate professor of government at Patrick Henry College, and currently teaches at Collegium Intermedium in Warsaw. He's best known for his books Taken into Custody, The New Politics of Sex, and a new book that we're going to be focusing on today, Who Lost America? Why the United States Went Communist, and What to Do About It. He is also known as a leading authority on divorce, child custody, and the family court system. So we're going to have some fun discussing those issues today. My itinerary for this is to kind of just spend a little time in both of our backgrounds, just so, if you're a first-time viewer, you can know who we both are. Then we'll kind of talk about the issues, and then we'll finish it off talking about possible solutions and taking some viewer questions. All right. You ready, Doctor?
Ready when you are.
Perfect. So just a little bit about myself. I was a child support officer. That was the title it was given us. It's basically a caseworker at a child support agency. And my job was to open up child support cases. I did the genetic tests, I did the swabs in the folks' mouth and figure out who's the dad, who's not the dad. It was my job to find out how much money people were making and then get orders to get that money and send that home to whoever the custodial party was. And I did that for a little over 5 years. And in that time, I got a pretty close look inside the system. And there were definitely things about the system I found questionable, which is, why I do this channel, which is just to educate people a little bit about the system we're living in and to discuss some of what I see as injustices in the system. Go ahead, Professor, if you'd like to introduce yourself further.
Well, excuse me. Well, you did an excellent job. I've like I say, I'm trained in political science. My interest is in things like political ideologies and comparative politics. And about 25 years ago, I got wrapped up in this subject. I found nobody had really come to it from the standpoint of a trained academic in a field like in a detached field like political science. So I found quite a wide open field for exploration, and I've kind of been doing it ever since.
Yeah, that's one thing I noticed because I actually first found you on Twitter. It might have been through Pearl or something like that, but I noticed your work and I found it quite impressive because that's something that's definitely missing, especially for us guys and kind of what we're dealing with, especially with marriage looks like today, child support, all these things is it's rare. I really never seen anybody else. So to see an actual academic, someone who is a professor, a PhD, be able to kind of speak for us and put this in a language that I think other intellectuals can understand is very rare. And from what I've read of your work and seen of your lectures, I think it's kind of invaluable to the space because so far, especially in the manosphere, as we call it, it's just a loose collection of guys and we kind of all understand that there's a problem here and we're trying to figure it out. We're trying to compare notes as best we can. But it tends to be very loosely put together. It tends to be prone to what I kind of call hijacking, whether it's a grifter of one sort or, somebody selling a self-improvement course or a pickup artist course or whatever it is. And that energy tends to end up somewhere maybe it shouldn't be. Maybe it makes the entire movement look bad. So this is kind of a breath of fresh air for me. And, what I also value about you is that I'm a younger guy. I'm a millennial. You're someone who I think has been kind of watching this entire catastrophe unfold, maybe even from the beginning of NoFault all the way up until what it is today. So I'm very interested, kind of, in your opinion of how we got here and what happened to get us here, basically.
No, that's precisely the role that I try to set for myself. I do listen a lot these days to the manosphere and the talk about marriage, family, sexual, gender issues, and there is an awful lot of chit chat, an awful lot of noise, an awful lot of he said, she said that I think dissipates energy. So I try to set the task for myself of sifting out what's really essential from what is just fun to talk about. and try to leave men, especially, with some idea of what direction they should be going in on this stuff. So, that's kind of what I see the job of an academic. If you're doing your job, which most of the academics are not, there's an awful lot of academics involved in the fields of divorce, family policy, child custody, child support. But they tend to be practitioners. They tend to have skin in the game. They tend to be, they're making money off it, frankly, because they're hired by the courts or whatever, and they have a pecuniary interest in perpetuating the system. They're not detached observers from a distance, and I should be, at least. If I'm not, I should do my best, because my field is not law or psychology or sociology or family policy or any of these kind of applied fields. My field is history and political science, and I should be able to at least try to maintain a certain amount of disinterested perspective on things. So.
Perfect. Yeah, and that's one thing I noticed also. I'll tell you this, just as someone who's worked in the system, and I have a bachelor's degree, so I can, maybe I've kind of seen a little bit how academics can get kind of stuck in this sort of mainstream idea, and it's very hard for them to speak against something that might get them looked at, negatively. So I understand the risk there. And even just working in child support, as you're working in there is a certain amount of propaganda. And I don't really have a better word to describe it, because it's like, as you're working there, they want to convince you that you're doing something good. You're helping families. They really train you in so much as you need to just to get the job done. There's not enough eagle-eyed look at it. But after piecing together a lot of the story and what happened, and looking at different academics in the field, and trying to understand how this affects families, and speaking with so many fathers, it's just so blatantly obvious that something is wrong. And one of the things that I kind of touched on, or sort of finally understood, was when you look at the origins of the federally created child support program, it really is a reaction to the creation of the welfare program in the United States. And it was more so an effort to get that money back. And really not so much to help families. It's more about getting the money back. Like you said, there is financial interest that the people who work in the system do have. Some of them a little less obvious than others. But to me, and what I really try to get across to people, is that what it represents to me is a sort of public family law intruding into the sphere of a private family law. And that was the part I didn't clearly understand so much, even while I was in the thick of it. But then when I saw, that from a sort of eagle-eyed view, I was able to then pinpoint all the instances of me working in there where we're just violating the privacy of families, and the state just punches its way into a family, even a family that's not on welfare, and basically leads to the disintegration of families.
Yeah, very much so. No, it's true. And in this respect, I mean, if your audience is trying to make sense of it all, the fact that it goes back to welfare, to the welfare state, which has its origins, after all, more than 100 years ago, in the early 20th century and even earlier, it really has to do with the way our society approaches the problem of the poor. It's the basic problem of modern industrial society. How do we approach the problem of poverty and the poor? How do we deal with the poor? And some societies dealt with that. Well, I mean, this was the origins of Marxism, of course, was the way that it was dealt with in 19th century England, primarily, first of all, and then Europe, and then later on in the United States. And we were how do you deal with that issue? And we haven't come up. The Americans came up with a different approach. They did not come up with Marxism. They've avoided Marxism for the most part, and they've avoided revolutionary politics, like was seen in the French and Russian and Chinese revolutions based on kind of socialist principles. So the Americans came up with this alternative welfare system, this kind of safety net, which was supposed to be, just a last resort. It was supposed to be not socialistic at all, but it, like everything else, it has some unintended consequences. So that's basically I think the the start of the problem. How do you deal with the poor?
Yeah, and that reminds me, and I might be a little fuzzy on this stuff, but I believe it's kind of rooted in what's called the Elizabethan Poor Laws, and back then, an illegitimate child or a child being born out of wedlock was relatively low. But it did happen, and when it happened, society kind of had to step in, especially if nobody was there to take care of that child. And you got to remember, this is way before genetic testing. Genetic testing in itself was like a nuclear bomb in giving child support power, because for the first time they can pinpoint exactly it was this guy. But then they had to deal with, okay, does he get a relationship with the child? Does he not get one? If he was never there, how does he go about that? And custody is a whole separate issue, especially the way we go about it. But there was always this kind of legal justification of, okay, the state can kind of barge into the sort of privacy of the family if, it's kind of becoming a burden on the public, if the poor is out here and it's taking up public resources, basically. So there was this kind of history of a public family law, somewhat, if you can call it that, up until you see this merger with the creation of the federal child support system. And the part about that is interesting is it started out as a system in 1975 that was only meant to work welfare cases, meaning that if a family had gone on welfare, then the federal child support system would kick in. Mom typically would sign away her rights to child support, would then legally go to the state, thus justifying the state's, if you can call it justification, justifying the state going after the dad to recoup the funds. But what we saw, I might be wrong here, I believe it was OBRA, Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act, is you saw states starting to get more money in order to advertise to families who were not on welfare. And it was a way, what they had sold it as is it was a way to stop families from needing to go on welfare. If you can get to them first and just get them the child support order. But in this way, you start seeing the system become bigger and pushing its way into private family law and sort of bullying its way in there.
Yeah, very much so. Very, very much became it very much became a system of a kind of law enforcement system, a very intrusive system of well, it's the great irony, of course, is it shifted the welfare system from a distributor of largesse, in other words, giving away money, to a raiser of revenue. So, taking in money. So the welfare system went diametrically opposite from giving away money, from being generous and, helping out the poor, to coming and putting the squeeze on low-income men, in this case, and trying to get it back again. If I could just back up a little bit.
Sure.
Just another implication of the origins of the child support system and welfare is that the welfare system, if you go back, again, to the origins of it back in the early 20th century, it was always from the beginning, I should say, it was to some extent ideologized. It was to some extent the creation of this famous, instigator of it was Jane Addams, who had her roots in anarchism and Marxism, communism. And what it did really was it did two things. It professionalized poor relief and it ideologized poor relief. Before that, going back to the Elizabethan poor law, poor relief had been a responsibility of the parish. But it had also been in England and in America, largely the responsibility increasingly of other churches as well became involved in poor relief, not just the Church of England. And you had a lot of, it was mostly run by churches and it was run by women, mostly volunteer women who were supported by their husbands and who, of course, were not professional social workers. Well, what you had in the early 20th century was the professionalization of social work. And this did two things. First, it gave the social workers, the women who had originally, the volunteer Christian women who had originally run poor relief, had an incentive to actually help the poor. They didn't have any incentive to make the problem worse or to continue it. They had an incentive to solve it. And what they did was they not only looked out for the material welfare of the poor, but they also looked out for they also enforced Christian sexual morality, which they knew rightly was the part of the problem, was women having children out of wedlock and single mothers. So they enforced Christian sexual morality and they relieved the poor. And these two together could have, and it essentially did, bring the problem. If it didn't eradicate the problem, it certainly brought the problem under control. Well, the professionalization of social work did something quite revolutionary. First, it created a core of professional social workers who had a vested self-interest, not in minimizing poverty, but in perpetuating poverty, in entrenching poverty, in creating as much poverty as possible. And because, of course, we all know when you have a bureaucracy that's dedicated to solving a problem, they will do anything to make sure that problem never goes away. And so they're not redundant. So unlike the Christian volunteer women, the professional social work women mostly had a vested interest in perpetuating the problem they were supposed to be solving. The second thing was that over the decades, these women gradually became more and more radicalized with radical feminism, so that the bureaucratic self-interest in perpetuating the problem dovetailed very elegantly with the ideological interest in hating men and extolling and exalting single motherhood as a virtue for its own sake. Single motherhood went from being a stigma to being a positive virtue. And you even had books coming out. When was it? In the 90s and the 2000s, books talking about what a wonderful thing single motherhood is. Peggy Drexler wrote one. What was it called? I forget the title. And there were a couple others like this saying what a great thing single motherhood is. So, the ideology and the bureaucracy were like this.
Yeah, those are excellent points, especially sexual immorality as well as the kind of, I don't know, almost deification of single motherhood. And that's something, I obviously, I'm from a younger generation. It's something I don't remember, but it's something I've tried to read about because I've tried to put myself in the mindset of how did these laws change in the first place? And, just looking at the graph, if you look at children born out of wedlock, I think in the mid 50s, it's at about 5%. And by 1975, it's at about 25%. And that's when they created the federal child support system because Congress took note of that. And then nowadays, and through the 2000s and everything, it's at about a steady 45% of kids being born out of wedlock, and it's become the new norm. And I know a lot of this goes into kind of birth control, in the sexual revolution, I guess you can say, in the change in culture, and sort of seeing this. My idea about this sort of deification of single motherhood came out of desperation almost from the government. And as we know, in the mid 90s, we had welfare reform, which had bipartisan support, and AFDC became TANF, temporary aid to needy families. And the idea was that, okay, if the children are under 18, they can receive welfare up until they're, emancipated. But that the mothers who were before then known as, there was this kind of buzz term welfare queens, because they would be receiving a grant that entire time also. And they had this incentive to kind of keep doing that. It also gave them a way out of living at home with their husband and being a wife and all that kind of stuff. They would max out after 2 years, right? So they put a 2-year time limit on that. And the idea was that there'd be programs to help these women find work and, they'd get them working. And I think around then there was probably also a lot more push of this sort of single mother propaganda, this strong and independent thing, because on the one sense, they're trying to sort of convince the women, hey, we want you back in the workforce instead of living off of welfare more so. And I think this whole sort of push rolled over into a culture that they did not expect was going to happen. I'm trying to be charitable to them. I think what they thought was going to happen was that it would get them working. It would help bring families back together. They would be very heavy on child support. They would get the money from child support. But instead, what happened is that it created this culture of single motherhood, not wanting to be in marriage. And now, I kind of come from a generation that has this pessimism of like traditionalism's not coming back. We're so far gone. But I've been trying to map out and see just all the actions that were taken that led us here.
Right. Well, I myself have, pardon me, it's taken me a little bit to put all this together too. a little bit of effort because nobody's written a history of this. I mean, other than my attempts. And so I mean, a good history of the welfare system could be written. It'd be very good. But if I could just, you mentioned the welfare reform of 1996,
Yep.
and that's very important because what I've discovered in writing this new book, pardon me, what I discovered in writing this new book was that that act had a key role in not only the changing the welfare and child support system, but in ideologizing it, in raising up the importance of political ideology. And if you'll bear with me, let me explain this because this was quite a. It took me a while to figure this out myself. But you remember Clinton came in and he
Hmm.
said he was going to reform welfare. And he got a lot of conservatives on his side because conservatives said, yeah, we need to reform welfare and we need to save some money and get these spongers back to work and all that. So Clinton, this was part of a larger promotion that Clinton was doing of presenting himself as a moderate. Clinton was not a left winger of the Democratic Party, and he was he was pushing to try to be Mr. Moderate, Southerner, and so forth. Um, and he didn't want to defend the welfare system. He knew it had to be changed, and so he wasn't trying to entice welfare recipients into becoming political radicals by any means. At least he didn't seem like it. And by the way, this was happening, by the way, in Britain at the same time. Clinton teamed up with Tony Blair, who
That's
was
interesting.
pushing himself as a moderate in Britain. And he said, after the Thatcher years, he said, we're not going back to the old socialism. We're not going back to the old Labour Party. We're not going back to Clause 4 and, the nationalization, the means of production. He and Clinton teamed up and they created this third way that was going to be more moderate between accepting the free market, no socialism, no big government, but, compassion for the poor. Well, Clinton did that, and he supposedly removed all these people from the welfare rolls. I don't know how successful that was. I'm told that Obama later put them all back on the welfare rolls. But anyway, let's give him the benefit of the doubt and say that he did reduce the welfare rolls. What he also did, was to grant this wish list for the radical feminists, especially, and that was the child support enforcement system, which was a pact of the devil between the conservatives who wanted to save money and the feminists who were already aspiring to quasi-police powers. The welfare system was increasingly conferring on the social workers, both first through child abuse accusations, which had mushroomed back around the same time, actually, starting in the 70s and really in the 80s, child abuse accusations, and then later on domestic violence accusations. And these were giving the social workers quasi-police powers and making them basically plainclothes police. And the child support system added a third leg to that, basically made them a enforcer, or again, quasi-police powers, which I'm sure you could talk about as well as I can, or better. But what it did also, well, it gave but what it especially did was it accelerated a process of the American left. The American left was already shifting from a radical social and economic radicalism, not quite socialist, but, quasi-socialist, concerned with the poor and with blacks and with the low income, to shifting to sexual politics. Sexual politics was becoming the vanguard of the American left. And this is what Clinton's welfare reform accelerated, because it took power away from those who, in the old days, the radical left had this fantasy, this crazy fantasy. It was embodied in two scholars named Piven and Cloward at Columbia University. And they had this fantasy that welfare recipients were someday going to rise up with, pitchforks or whatever, and smash the system and create a socialist revolution. Okay. It
Hmm.
never had the faintest prayer of ever happening. Although conservatives nowadays take it seriously. They have this idea that the Piven-Cloward thesis, the Cloward plan, is what radicalized America. Well, it did no such thing. It failed miserably. Welfare recipients never rose up to create a revolution. Okay, so it didn't happen, and it was never going to happen. What it did do, though, what radicalized the welfare system was not Marxists like Piven and Cloward. It was feminists who used the welfare reform of 96 to acquire these police powers that they then used by launching sexual accusations, first against men in families, domestic violence, and so forth in divorce proceedings and welfare custody proceedings. And then later, it worked so successfully, they took it into the public sphere and they created the Me Too movement. And they started using it against people like Bill Cosby and the Prince of York. And of course, Judge Brett Kavanaugh, Trump's Supreme Court nominee.
This is
So,
I'm sorry to interrupt you.
no, go ahead.
This is an excellent point, and it's something that I did read in your work, and it's not something that I thought of. I mean, it's something I saw every day in terms of, the domestic violence, temporary orders, and the accusations, being able to weaponize the system. But then when you pointed out how kind of taking it from this micro sort of everyday level and how it was kind of refined there and perfected there to then be used as a weapon on the political scale, whether it was this whole fiasco with Brett Kavanaugh, even influential celebrities, whoever basically controls the levers of power in order to sort of bypass any other way, but to kind of get them to do what they want, to sort of bend the knee, if you will. It was something that I thought was a very well put together point, and I appreciated that because it enlightened me a bit on how culture even can be used to sort of subvert the laws and then be weaponized in order to frankly take people's freedoms away and to kind of have a stranglehold on everything. You brought up so many good points in with your last statements here. Just to touch on it briefly, the welfare reform of 1996 really was the beefing up of child support. And it is just as you say, we really are the sort of enforcement quasi police arm of the sort of welfare feminist state apparatus, if you will. And one of the things people don't understand, and this is something I lived every day, like when I get to my desk, how much information we collect on people, how much information the government collects on you, even if you're not in the system, that will then become available to me the second you are in the system, and then the amount of enforcement actions we have. I mean, we could take away your driver's license, take away your passport. We can take away your bar license, medical license, even your fishing license if we really want to. Throw people in jail, for contempt for missing payments that they can't pay. Bank levies. If I, as a child support officer, found out your parents own a house and you have debt, we can put a lien on that house just in case for if it's going to pass on to you, we can intercept it. Gambling winnings. There was so many things that we were able to do. And it's like the minute someone's social security number is put into this monstrosity of a system, after a couple days, it just spits out all this information. I can see all the past jobs you had, all the quarterly earnings going back years, bank accounts, past addresses, name aliases, phone numbers. We would call relatives. And it is just the minute you get stuck in that system, it's over. And, for typically the mom here, especially if men are taught to be providers, for them, it represents this, I want to say free, but essentially taxpayer driven system that allows them to bypass, filing on their own. It allows them to just come in, fill out the easiest of paperwork, and we just do the rest. But when that same guy would come in to the desk and say, okay, I say, hey, you owe $1,500 a month now. You're the dad. It's too late for a genetic test because the kid's over 2, in California specifically. They would say, hey, she's not letting me see my kid. I'm trying to see my kid. And I'd say, hey, I'm sorry. That sounds really terrible, but you got to go across the street and file your own custody motion. So there's nothing for men on the other side that is taxpayer driven, or can at least give them some pathway to be able to see their kids without them having to spend thousands of dollars to do so while they're already under the weight of having to pay child support. Otherwise, they're going to lose their work licenses. They're going to end up in jail. The bank levies, everything's going to happen. So to me, it was just incredibly obvious how oppressive the system is and how destructive it is to fathers and to fatherhood in general, let alone what you're pointing out. Now it affects, politics to the deepest degree and anything like that.
Yeah, I'm glad you pointed out that dimension and that background, because I think I'm sure a lot of your viewers are unaware of this. And I've been maintaining, and a big argument of the book is that the original deep state is not the FBI or the CIA or Homeland Security. The original deep state is the welfare state. And the most evident manifestation of that is what you just described, the child support system. And this is not on anybody's radar screen. I mean, I'm sure that readers who come to my book now are going to say, why is this guy wittering on at length about the child support system? I have no, what does that have to do with me? And that's the problem, is, you might not be interested in the child support system, but the child support system is interested in you. As Trotsky said about the revolution. And we ignore this kind of injustices to our peril, because when you cannot quarantine this kind of injustice, you can't just subject a part of the population, or initially low income, mostly minority men were the victims of it, were the targets, and then increasingly middle class men and white men and so forth. But you can't just quarantine this. It will eventually spread. It will eventually, and other people will become the targets. And, I know, for example, many of the methods that you outlined of the child support system have been discussed for the taxation, for the tax system, as a way of squeezing taxes out of the rest of the population. Things like, garnishing wages and confiscating passports and this kind of thing. If it works for child support, why shouldn't it be used for? Why shouldn't the IRS use it?
What's interesting about that, and that's exactly right. From what I've seen, the child support system, as it was, reformed in the mid '90s, was actually inspired by the IRS system. And there was I believe she was a director out of a child support agency in Delaware. Her name was Marilyn Ray Smith, and she actually spoke in front of Congress a few times. And what she wanted was for child support to basically have the same power as the IRS, And that is essentially what they gave her. And all these systems kind of work in tandem to each other to create this just very invasive system that can see into everything you're doing. And it can be used, whether it's through IRS information, and all these other ways of getting it. There's something that you said also that reminds me of something that I read in your book, Who Lost America, that I wanted to bring up. And this idea that, nobody cares, like, what does child support have to do with me? And this is something that I've kind of spoke about on my channel too, for I think a lot of people, especially traditional conservatives, and these folks like that, they kind of don't care about what men are going through, especially if they haven't gone through it themselves. Because to them, it's like, oh, those are just those bad people on the other side of the railroad tracks who just can't seem to get it together. If only they can just, be good, then they wouldn't be complaining like that. And it's definitely a result of their own bad decisions. So they have no problem smearing men who are doing that. But then what's happened is now that problem has fomented and, sort of boiled over to such a degree that it now affects normal middle class families. It now affects the elite class families. And there was something that you mentioned, I believe it was page 174 in your book. But it was about how white women were envious of the emancipation the welfare system gave black women. And it was just interesting to me because it sort of is another thing that sort of speaks to how this subculture was created. Because it is true, the child support system and the family law system that we have is incredibly oppressive, especially to the African American community and folks that maybe weren't as well to do as middle class, upper class America. And it systematically took out the father. It almost used them as a petri dish to see, how to do this effectively. And then it created a culture that was then exported to the mainstream. And frankly, at this point, it has become mainstream. So that part was really interesting to me.
No, absolutely. That's true. I've said for a long time, I think others have used the same phrase, that the low-income black male was the kind of canary in the mine shaft. Where he goes, the rest of us are going to go too. And what you said about the traditional conservatives and how they relegate this to the other side of the tracks. I have to say, one theme of the book I point out is we all kind of did that for a while. I mean, I speak as a sort of middle class, as a middle class white male, but I didn't concern myself for years with what was going on in the inner cities of of Washington or New York or the Bronx or Anacostia or South Chicago, and when we allow a part of the population to be subject to this, it can come back to haunt all of us. I mean, that's what Martin Luther King said. He said, "An injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere."
I was just thinking about that quote, so you read my mind.
Yeah, Frederick Douglass said something similar. I mean, he said the white man, in the days of slavery, that the white man's freedom is marked out for the same grave as the black man's. And we heeded those warnings. We understood that. People saw it. The framers of the Constitution, by the way, they saw it back in the 18th century. They saw that slavery could not continue because it would eventually destroy the entire Constitution. And we listened to them, but eventually cost the Civil War, but we did it. But now, the same thing is happening. Something, in some ways, even more devastating. We've allowed the low-income black male to be destroyed over the course of decades, not by slavery, not by segregation, but by the benign hand of the welfare system. And it's coming for the rest of us if we don't pay attention. And yeah, you can see the feminists. Just a big part of this is the sexual radicalism that drives the welfare system and the family courts and the child support system. It's all devised by the feminists. They invented NoFault Divorce. They invented all of this in many ways with the connivance of the legal machinery, legal profession. But the feminists did this, and yes, they could see this very clearly. The black women might be poor, but they were powerful in their communities. They were powerful. And the white feminists saw this, and this is what they wanted for themselves. This is why they invented NoFault Divorce, which allowed them to spread the welfare system to the white middle class, the middle class generally. And that's what they've been doing and that's what they did with the welfare reform in the 90s, and that's what they've been pushing for ever since. So. Yeah,
that is God. There's so many things there that I just want to expand on. Definitely want to talk about no-fault divorce, because the way no-fault divorce and especially false domestic violence claims just works hand in hand with the child support system. It's almost seamless. It's strangely an engineering marvel at this point. But just as a caseworker on a personal level, sitting down and looking at order after order, judgment after judgment cross my desk, because I would see judgments from the private law system. I would see the difference between guys who were married and guys who had a kid out of wedlock, and what that meant for how much they were going to have to pay and how much they were going to be punished. And the sad conclusion I came up with was that it was almost as if the more, I don't want to use the word moral, but the more you tried to do what you were supposed to do, the more money you tried to make for your family, the better of a job you had, the more on the grid, over the table career you had. It just seemed like you were punished way harder for doing that versus, someone on the bottom who even though we can get an order against him, we just can't, take blood out of a turnip. I just unfortunately can't reach into the pockets of some guy selling stuff on the corner and be able to get any money. And then if you just look at the amounts of the child support amounts plus the spousal support for the guys who were married, to me, it suddenly becomes this sort of obvious thing of like the marriage contract has been completely neutered at this point. It doesn't give men what it used to give men. Frankly, there are legal systems created outside of the marriage contract that a man can avail himself of to get things like custody or paternity if he wants. So there's no incentive to sign the marriage state contract. And then worse yet, there's less incentive to even work hard and be a productive citizen because you're going to get punished harder for it. I saw high profile cases come through. I've even worked on some. I've seen celebrities, real estate moguls, rappers, whoever come through and watch the money get siphoned from them until it frankly ruins their career and their lives.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. It is utterly cynical. I mean, I suppose the ultimate one is, it's very strange when they're trying to establish paternity and they want to force a man who is not the sperm donor, who's not the biological father. Mm-hmm. They want to force him to pay child support because he makes more money probably. So
Yes,
the rationalization they use for forcing him to pay more money is that when they take the child away from him, he was the one who was involved in the child's upbringing.
exactly.
He was the one raising the child. He was doing the
Yeah,
right
best
thing.
interest of the child,
Yeah.
right
So
there.
therefore, that's a rationalization for making him for taking the child away from him, first of all,
Hmm.
and then making him pay, for pay for the child that what was never biologically his in the first place. So you're right. It's utterly cynical.
It's funny. In my mind, I kind of have this divide in regards to how the child support system and family law basically oppresses men. I hate to use that word, but that's what it's doing. And in one sense, I separate it between paternity and then the financial stuff. So I put the financial stuff here and I put the stuff on paternity here. And the paternity part of this, I'm so glad you brought that up, is the most mind blowing to me. And frankly, it's like if you're married, it's even worse. But first, right off top, as a child support officer, the agency goes off what the mom tells them. So, dad could be someone who's in prison right now, but there could be this other guy involved, and she might name the other guy involved that has the steady job. And then, a lot of our orders were also made on default. Maybe they ignored us. Maybe we did a bad job of getting a hold of them. But either way, we would say, okay, we tried, 30 days has passed. We're just going to default him as the father. So that means no genetic test happened or anything like that. The other side of this, because I'm going to kind of go on a little rant, but people don't understand like paternity laws and the way it works. It used to just be if you two were married and your wife issued a child and you two were married, you were legally the father. Because, there were no genetic tests back then.
That's
And
right.
being married, there was an incentive for men because what you can, you would now have rights over that child, parental rights and all the
Right.
things that came with that.
Right.
But as all these kids were being born out of wedlock, they had to create other means in order to establish legal paternity because that was the only way they can then go after the guys for the money. So then we got the voluntary declaration of paternity system. And what that was is that they created paperwork essentially that all hospitals have. You can sign them at a child support agency and other places, but it's basically an adoption form. I mean, to put it in its simplest form. And when the child is born, they will confront you with this and they will ask you to sign. If you sign it here in California after 2 years, just like with marriage, if you don't ask for a genetic test, it's over. You're the father no matter what. Even if 7 years down the line, the kid's 5, 7 years in the relationship, mom says she cheated on you, it's not yours. Even if you find out it's not your child, it's too bad. They're gonna say you've been in the child's life. You are on the hook, even if you don't have custody of the child. So, I saw these different ways paternity was established: marriage, through the paternity declaration, and then through a judgment, which is what we did at the child support agency. And what I also found from that is if you're a guy, it's just yet another reason to not want to sign the marriage contract because what you're doing is you're giving this sustained consent that all the babies that my wife has are mine legally also. Okay. And if you avoid the marriage contract, I think tradcons will try to say, well, it gives you parental rights. They don't talk about this too deeply, but really it's like I can sign the paperwork at at the hospital if I'm confident about it. I can take a genetic test. I can go into the child support agency and ask them to open up a case against me. So if mom wants to play hardball and say, hey, I'm not letting you see the baby and you're not the dad, too bad. I can go into the child support agency and say, hey, can you file a case against me and give me a genetic test? And they will do that for me. So it's still yet another reason. And it's yet another example of creating an entire legal framework that yet again chops at the tree of marriage and makes it even less worth it for men. So they're doing more harm than good.
Yes, no, absolutely. And that's worth stopping on for just a moment, because what they've done, just to underline that, is to invert the very purpose of marriage. Marriage originally, as you say, was the way of conferring fatherhood. Marriage created fatherhood, and you can see that in the English common law. Lord Mansfield's rule that the
Hmm.
father was officially the husband of the mother, not the biological sperm donor. The husband of the mother was the father, and if there was an interloper and a child was created by the interloper, then the husband had the right of first refusal. He could raise that child as his own if he wished to, or he could divorce.
Hmm.
But this was in the Napoleonic Code. Also, marriage and this is absolutely true. Marriage creates fatherhood, and as you say, the child support. Well, the combination of no-fault divorce and child support inverted that principle, so that marriage simply became a way of trapping the man into paying child support for a child that he has no rights over, the child that's taken away from him through the divorce.
Exactly.
So from an institution that conferred parental and paternal rights specifically, it went from an institution that creates the leverage for ripping the child away and destroying the paternal rights. And so this is yeah, and this actually shows another dimension to the hypocrisy of the traditional conservatives who are always going on about marriage, saving marriage, reinforcing marriage, the importance of marriage, and they want to rescue marriage from the homosexuals and from the transsexuals and from everybody, but they don't want to rescue marriage from the divorce courts or from the feminists. And this is unbelievably ironic. You mentioned that at the beginning of our discussion, you said there were no academics that were getting involved in this stuff besides me. But I actually, one exception was kind of amusing, is an article by a political scientist named Mark Smith. And he wrote an article a few years ago in which he looked into the divorce system, and he discovered how all these pro-family, self-styled pro-family groups focus on the family research council, family this, family that, take no interest whatsoever in any of these issues, in divorce, in child custody, in parental rights, paternal rights, child support, nothing. They just completely stay out of it.
It's so confusing. I don't understand why that is. You think they would be the first ones on it. And this is, I don't understand if they're just perfectly happy with kind of trying to slave a man's labors and to just use him to extract money out of to keep the system going. I don't know if they're complicit. It's I don't know if they have to believe this because it'll make them have to maybe look at their beliefs a different way or confront the church. I just don't understand what the incentive is and why they just won't talk about the elephant in the room.
Right. Well, that's what this political scientist said, Mark Smith. He's astonished by this. He just scratches his head and say they worry about homosexuality, they worry about abortion, they worry about um, religious freedom, but they have euthanasia, but they have nothing whatsoever to say about divorce. And it's a combination of things. One, I think for fundraising, it's much more effective to rant on about all the horrible things that the homosexuals and transgenderists are doing. So that fills up their coffers more quickly by dwelling on that. They also there's a lot of Republicans and conservative legal practitioners who are making a lot of money on divorce. They've got their noses in the trough, and they don't want to. Many of these pro-family groups are run by lawyers and run by legal practitioners, and they're members of the same bar associations as their friends. The Republicans who are making money on all, and Republican judges as well who are making money on this. So that's part of it. I think they're also afraid of the kind of right-wing feminists within the Republican Party and within the Christian churches. There's a kind of right-wing feminist who likes the power. That they're not doctrinaire feminists, but they like the power that is conferred upon them if they decide to divorce. And we know that Catholics and evangelical Christians are just as likely to divorce as are atheists and secularists and Democrats. So it's a combination of things.
Yeah, that's interesting, and it makes sense. I guess two things from that. I know in one sense what I've heard, and I've seen some stats. I don't know how true they are, but I know that I think the demographic that makes the most donations, I guess you can say, to the church is women. I don't know how true that is, but that's what I've heard. And I do understand that conservatives now have to try to appeal to the vote for women. And one thing, that I notice is like abortion seems to be the thing that they're most passionate about. And they just stop right there at abortion, though. They don't go further to discuss fatherhood or any of these other issues. And even Trump, I noticed this. I saw this clip just a few days ago, and he basically has this policy about IVF, in vitro fertilization. It's expensive, typically applies to women who are a little bit older that might need that help. And to me, okay, great, I get it. That's how they want to put up the birth rate, but it still kind of just panders to women's issues or for women's votes and completely just sidelines the guys. I mean, there's no discussion of family law at all. And it's just mostly, if it affects the ladies, then okay, it's got our attention. I guess they're just held hostage by these votes or the donations or whatever it is. And it's just, it kind of leads me into wanting to discuss maybe solutions a bit. It's like, what can men do, especially as a collective, to try to push back on this a little?
Well, that's the question, and it hasn't been addressed, and that actually is a big part of the purpose of my new book. Because I do come up with what I think are a single, really a single solution, more than any other, and it's not original. I didn't think of it by myself. Another scholar who came before me, who is a brilliant man, and named Daniel Emnaeus, I'll talk about in a moment, maybe. But yeah, that's the problem, because even the fatherhood advocates, the fathers' rights activists, men's rights activists, I think they have not come up with a really very plausible set of solutions and remedies. They're very divided. They're very splintered. They're on the manosphere also chattering about this and that and this unfairness and that unfairness, all of which is true, by the way. There's plenty of unfairnesses, but I don't think any of them are nearly as important as this one. I think this is the single most important issue in the relation between the sexes and in the emasculation of men today by far. So I do propose a remedy in the end. I don't want to give away too much of the game, but I will say that I was inspired by I was inspired by two things. One was a scholar, as I mentioned, Daniel Emnaeus, a brilliant man who wrote a book. He was a Shakespeare scholar. I can't get his Shakespeare books, unfortunately. They're very hard to find. But anyway, he wrote a book called The Case for Father Custody back in the 90s. And it's an absolutely brilliant book. I highly recommend it. It's online. You can download it for free. Case for Father Custody by Daniel Emnaeus. And his basic argument is that a presumption of father custody would basically not only reform the divorce system and the whole entourage, the whole machinery we've been discussing, but he says it would basically put the feminist enterprise out of business. And I think he's right about that. If he is right about that, it would not only put the feminist enterprise out of business, it would put the entire left out of business, because the feminists are by far the dominant element. The dominating element on the American left today is sexual ideology, and above all, the radical feminists. They control the left.
It's definitely an interesting proposal, and I agree. Something needs to be done about custody first and foremost, and then I think maybe you can see that sort of reverberate in the culture. I guess the one issue I see a little bit, and this kind of goes out of no-fault divorce, because typically custody is given to who has the relationship with the child and all these things. But with no fault, with the father in the house, you'll see a lot of domestic abuse claims because basically, the mom's trying to go for custody. And I remember a coworker of mine who'd been there for years, and he was just like, hey, this is the secret right here. Because you can get a temporary restraining order based off whatever accusations, you make. And then they would put out a hearing. It would be 6 to 8 weeks, maybe longer. God forbid it's COVID time or something. And, by that time, dad's not allowed in the house. Mom's already come to the child support agency. We've already got the ball rolling. We know custody's zero. And it kind of creates this new normal. But my fear is that with the presumptive custody, there would be women out there trying to weaponize domestic violence claims a lot more. And that's always the threat, too. You know what I mean? That really is the threat that they hold over the guys. And, and this also goes into a discussion of, is going back to at-fault divorce the answer? I like at-fault divorce as a system. I did have a chance to ask James Sexton the question. He was on stream and there was only like 20 people there. So I put a question in the chat and he answered it. But there seems to be this kind of idea out there that even if we got back to at-fault, especially with cell phones and things, it would just increase the number of domestic violence claims. Which I might still be able to accept that deal versus what we have now.
Yeah.
But I am curious to your opinion on how that affects everything.
Well, you're right. It certainly would increase those accusations. There's no doubt about it. because it would pull the rug out of every other rationalization for mother custody. So that would be the one they would fall back on. But I don't think there's any way to avoid that. I think we have to bite that bullet because let's not forget, after all, that false accusations of a crime is itself a crime.
Yeah. Is that perjury?
You make yeah, you perjure yourself and bring a false accusation of a crime against an innocent person. That itself is a crime that should be punished. And I don't think there's any alternative but to bite that bullet and say that, women or anybody who makes false accusations of a crime should be arrested and tried and punished for that. I think we have to do that. And yeah, when I talk about paternal custody, it's a little more complicated. So I lay it out, I hope, a little more clearly in the book. But it is talking about going back to a system of, well, I argue that the whole concept, not just no-fault divorce, but the whole concept of no-fault justice is a contradiction in terms. You cannot have no-fault justice. Justice requires, if you're going to involve courts and the penal system and punishments, then you have to have some fault. You can't just punish people for the way they live their lives. And so it has to be you have to have a fault-based system of justice, or it's no system of justice at all. And
That makes
yeah.
I'm sorry, that makes a lot of sense, especially how, you can't, it's an oxymoron. And, an idea of justice ideally is governed in some sense of morality, whatever that comes from, but ideally a shared sense of value and morals within a society. And the immediate thing you notice about no-fault divorce is that, and I noticed this just as the child support officer, because, I would have mom come in, then I would have dad come in, and they'd give me compelling stories. But a lot of the time, I hear this person cheated on me, this happened, all these bad, horrible things that they tell me, which, I believe them, it's true, but I would say it doesn't even take a backseat. Frankly, it just gets thrown out the window. All I'd hear is, oh, you got zero custody. Okay, you're working here. This is your address. And let me just punch that in the calculator and okay, you owe, $1,200 a month.
That's right.
So there's no morality in the system, frankly, at this point. And, that's something I've heard as a criticism towards traditional conservatives, because they'll say God should be in your marriage, all these things. And, hey, I got no problem with that. But it's like when you're standing there in family law court or, the public family law court, there is no mention of any kind of morality anywhere. It really is just who has the money.
Or justice. It removes justice. It removes justice from the justice system. I mean, you don't have a justice system. You don't have a judiciary anymore. If it doesn't dispense justice, it becomes simply a bureaucratic agency, and eventually it will start dispensing injustice, which is what it's doing. So no, you cannot have no fault justice. It's a prescription for legal nihilism and legal chaos, and that's precisely what we have. It's taken some decades to work out to its conclusion, but that's what we have today: is legal nihilism, legal chaos, and that's why prosecutors like Jack Smith can bring these lawfare operations against Steve Bannon and Donald Trump and the January 6th protesters, because the chaos, the legal system is in a state of complete chaos and nihilism, and it's completely politicized. And that's what I argue in the new book. I argue that they learned these techniques, and they developed these powers of legal, politicized justice from the divorce system and the family law system, because that is by far the dirtiest cesspool in the legal system. And from there, it's just poisoning the whole rest of the legal system.
I had maybe two solution ideas I wanted to run past you. And I know we're pushing an hour, so maybe we can discuss these and then maybe just get to a couple of viewer questions. But the first thing, so I got one that's maybe pretty radical, so I'll save that for the second one. But the first one is as far as some kind of maybe even taxpayer funded custody system that basically is the government saying, hey, we care about fathers being in their children's lives. Because again, if you're a woman, you walk right into child support. We handle everything for you from top to bottom. It's not going to cost you anything to get moving docs filed and pay for all these things. The county attorney is going to be there on your behalf or on the child's behalf, as they'll like to say. But when it comes to the guy, I would just give him a self-help form and say, all right, well, here's self-help. You might want to talk to an attorney to figure out how to do custody. And I almost believe it's like if we're going to have a child support system that's this strong, we should also have a custody system that men can avail themselves of and say, hey, I can't see my child. Please help me see my child. And there should be caseworkers there that are helping him at least get this into court, to at least get it seen by a judge and figuring out, instead of men having to not only pay spousal, child support, and everything else, and then trying to live outside in some apartment on the, other side of town while working, but then also having to, hire attorneys, pay all these legal fees to just see their children. So I want to know what you maybe think about that, if it's possible or if it's going to be too top heavy or.
Well, it's a nice idea. I mean, I suppose it can't hurt. The reason I would be skeptical is because all during the Clinton administration and later into the Bush administration, there were these fatherhood programs. It was all the rage in the late 90s. All these programs they had to reunite fathers with their children and to teach good fathering and to teach all this. It was just window dressing, and it was mostly, if you scratch beneath the surface, it was basically pay child support. It was all this talk about reuniting the fathers, but it had
That's the
nothing to do with that.
propaganda.
And then Bush came along and he relabeled the same exact programs. He relabeled them as marriage promotion. Clinton was and Gore were promoting fatherhood. Bush was promoting marriage, but it was the same thing. It was collecting child support. And he was even baptizing church groups, religious groups, to collect child support, so-called pro-family church groups, pro-family religious groups. So I'm a little skeptical about that kind of thing. I mean, frankly, I would like to see some, linking up of custody with child support. But basically, I think the solution is to enforce parental rights so that you can't take the children away from the father in the first place unless he's done something legally wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And secondly, I think child support should be for fathers who are at least at a bare minimum, they've at least acquiesced in the divorce or the separation. I mean, yes, if they've abandoned their children, then if they really have abandoned their children, and I don't accept that in most cases, if that's really the case, well, then child support is appropriate for them. Or if they've at least acquiesced and agreed to the divorce. But as you say, there's numerous fathers, they never even agreed to it in the first place. The children was just taken from them.
Yep. The order's defaulted. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, they never agreed to the divorce. It's unilateral, involuntary divorce. And then the children are taken also, and the father sent the bill. Well, that's obviously contrary to the common law. Principles of property and presumption of innocence and so forth. And I mean, that's just absolutely unacceptable to allow that kind of conflict of interest where government officials can take your children and then force you to pay for it.
There is another thing before I get to my second more radical solution. There is a second thing I wanted to make sure to point out to you because I wanted to share this with you. And, just briefly, we talked about earlier how child support was created in order to recoup money back that was expended through welfare, and this was sold to both parties, but especially conservatives as a mean to go after the deadbeat dads, go after the welfare queens, get the money back, get the tax money back, get it back into the government coffers. And it's interesting. There's been some changes in California that I think you'd find quite interesting. And when I used to work there, we had this program called Compromise of Arrears program. And those are people who owed money not to the other party, but to the state specifically. So it was prior public assistance money that had been expended. And sometimes if it looked like they were trying to pay, but they just couldn't, we would sometimes do a compromise with them in which they can pay us a lump sum amount. And, we would take that and then the state would write off what was owed. And some guys in there were lifers, like they were never going to pay it off, no matter how hard they worked, because the interest would build up and it was just really, really bad. More recently, though, however, the Compromise of Arrears program has changed into, I believe it's the debt reduction program. It's called DRP. My old coworkers and I call it DERP for short, which they're not allowed to say. But it's essentially an initiative from Governor Newsom. And basically, prior to this, there had been some talk of reparations for the Black community. And one of the things inside this study of what reparations might look like was forgiving past child support for African Americans. That didn't go through. But what happened quietly is that they're just they're basically processing these debt amounts and accepting $0 and just letting them go through. And then on the other side, what they're doing is if they do collect some amount of money, they're sending it to the mom, even if it's actually owed to the state. And this is based off of some studies. There was an all county letter, which means that every county, because each county has its child support agency in California. It's from the office of the governor also, but it's sent to every single child support agency, and it's changing their policies on something. So they're not going to open foster care cases on parents who make less than $100,000, basically. And it's all in the name of, and it's them basically admitting first and foremost that child support harms poor families. There are studies on that.
Hmm.
Women receive more money from the dad if child support's not involved. If
Yeah.
it is involved, they get less, and it just creates a debt. And I know as a caseworker, the hardest cases to collect on are typically the welfare cases, because it's not like
Yeah.
the guy has an over the table job that I can just easily send a wage garnishment to. And I can even read you this quote. In addition, this is from the all county letter, number 23-29. In addition, a collaborative report out of San Francisco called The Payback Problem concluded that over half of California's arrears are owed by parents who earn less than $10,000 a year in income, but who owe more than $20,000 in debt. It is easy to then make the connection to the negative impact on future financial stability of families and children, since child support arrears can greatly impact families' ability to meet their day-to-day needs. So that's them kind of admitting it. But what they're doing is they have all these cases that they can't collect on. It looks bad on the books. They want to find a way to get rid of these cases so that they can go back to the federal government later and say, hey, look, our performance measures are higher. Give us more money. But then also what it's doing is it's actually completely against the original spirit of what child support was created in the first place. Because if you're not collecting the welfare money back and sending it back to into the government, coffers or exchequer or whatever, you're just it basically is a kind of form of socialism, because now the mom gets child support and she gets the welfare monies at the same, basically one after another. That's basically what they're doing. And they're kind of sneaking this through in California. And my guess is that they're going to have this happen here for a bit, and then it's going to go to the other states.
That's interesting. I was not aware of that trend. I've not kept up with the most recent developments. But that's interesting. I mean, I suppose it's, as humane a way out of it as one could expect. At least they're not making more. I suppose it mitigates the hardship on men who are, could easily be made homeless by it. And many have been made homeless by it. So, I mean, I suppose that's something.
Yeah.
I'm a little surprised, frankly, but, I suppose something had to give, I suppose.
Yeah. Well, yeah, it's just that so many of these that they don't collect on. But here's the part that's particularly egregious to me. So now what we have was a system that was originally meant for people who are on welfare. And if they're going to go ahead and make it easier for those folks, we are now left with the husk of a system designed by the poor laws, and it just applies to the middle class and upper class. So we have something, the middle class has something they never asked for. That was an outcropping of a system designed to get welfare monies back, got so powerful that it now just breaks up normal American families. And they're going to sit here and basically insult us by letting the other, folks off the hook. It's just weird. It's not that I don't want their lives to be easier. I do. But the fact they need to do something for families who aren't on welfare in the first place. And they're easily able to collect. You just send the wage garnishment. You get the money from the guy with the normal job. Why is that guy going under, is the victim of a system originally meant for welfare?
Right, very, very true. Because he's got deep pockets, and
it's easy to get the money.
Yeah, that's right. Now, he pays voluntarily. He'll pay anyway.
Yeah, because they're good citizens.
Yeah, good fathers. Yeah, he's gonna do it. Yeah.
So just beyond that, I'll go to my more radical solution. And I did read some of the parts in your book, Who Lost Control, which I'll put a link to down in the description, by the way, so folks can easily find that Amazon link. But I made a video a while back, and it kind of dovetails in with election season. And, one movement I'm particularly aware about is MGTOW. And you got a lot of guys walking away from relationships. You got a lot of guys just saying, you know what, if the juice isn't worth the squeeze, they're basically boycotting marriage. And you got some guys that'll go as far as becoming passport bros and leaving the country they love, leaving their extended families to go seek greener pastures elsewhere where the legal system makes a little bit of sense. And my kind of radical idea, and the reason I think you might not like this is because I saw it was a lecture of yours on Paul Elam, ICMI 24. And I believe you said this upcoming election is the most important election of our lives. And you said you've been seeing elections since the 60s. And my idea was to take a little bit of that MGTOW spirit and apply it to basically this year's vote. Because the way I see it is that both parties are not helping men. Men are willing to just give up their entire lives to go somewhere else. They're walking away from marriage and kids, which is supposed to be a crown to one's life, a shining achievement. So my recommendation, we know men vote conservative more than women. We know the conservatives need our vote more than the other side. I want them to boycott this election and to be loud about it so that they can get the fear put in them that, oh my gosh, men are sick of us. And they're walking away from even voting at this point because the value of the vote has been so diluted and all they care about is getting the votes. They take the votes for granted. Maybe this time I don't want to give them my vote because they haven't done anything about anything I care about at this point.
That's certainly a very tempting solution. I can see the virtue in it. I had friends in the past election in Britain in July. I had friends who, on the conservative side, who advocated something similar. They wanted to see the Conservative Party go under. They wanted the Conservative Party not to get any votes and to go out of business because they were so disillusioned with what it had done, what it had not done. So something similar. I mean, that would be very interesting to hand the election to Kamala Harris, of all people,
basically as a threat.
Yeah, as a threat. Would that be a credible threat? Well, what is there to lose? I think there's a lot, actually. I think Kamala Harris would be unusually extreme with her background as a prosecutor. I can't imagine living under a Kamala Harris presidency, but never mind. I like the thought. I do believe if you, again, to just allude to my book without going into detail, I also have been impressed with the MGTOW phenomenon, not because I entirely agree with it, but because it gives enormous leverage to men. And
I agree.
It gives the fact that men are spontaneously boycotting, striking. Helen Smith wrote a good book about it 10 years ago called, it's not called The Marriage Strike, but something like that. Men on Strike. Helen Smith. And she points this out, and others had noticed it too, even before that men were not marrying, not having children. And they were doing it mostly as a defensive measure. They were not doing it as a political, to gain political leverage for reform purposes. They were doing it simply to protect themselves. They were just staying away from marriage because they didn't want to be destroyed by the divorce machinery. My argument, though, is that this is sad. This is too bad. If this is the reason they're doing it, and it is, then it is sad and too bad and tragic that they have to live without marriage and family life and children and so forth, which is one of life's greatest joy, frankly. But I also argue that the MGTOW as a means to an end, as a way of acquiring political leverage for the purpose of reforming, striking the fear into the political class and reforming the courts, the divorce laws, the child support, the domestic violence, child abuse. I think this would be a very good strategy. If you see any strike should be a means to an end. It shouldn't be an end in itself. And to go on strike or to boycott marriage and families and just say to the women, look, I'd love to marry you. I'd like nothing more. But, if you want to get married, you got to help me and my friends reform the divorce laws and recruit the women as well, because the women are already complaining about this, that the men are not married, the men are staying away from it. And these conservatives, especially the evangelical Christians and other conservatives, are going apoplectic about this. They're nagging, they're scolding, they're wagging their finger at the men and calling them puerile and calling them, all kinds of ugly names. But what do you expect? Unless you're willing to reform the laws, and the problem will go away. Nagging and scolding people never did any good. Why not look at the problem with the laws and reform them? That's what Republican and conservative public policy think tanks and universities and political parties, that's what they should be doing, not scolding citizens for the way they live their lives.
Yeah, that's the part that's interesting to me too, especially because I think us as Americans we're kind of conditioned to believe like our vote once every 4 years is being politically active. But there's
Yeah,
so many things that even
exactly.
I'm ignorant to that's like in terms of lobbying or creating, these kinds of groups that have some kind of pull over politicians. And I know there's been these kinds of men's rights groups in the past, and I almost wish I can say I'm a card carrying member of the MRA, Men's Rights Association, and we're working hard to get all these things changed, almost like the NRA or something like that. But I do understand that it's tough. And then it depends who's doing it and if they have a good handle over everything. My hope would be that a boycott of the election would take notice, and in the spirit of good politics, maybe the conservatives would come back and say, "Here's a platform. Do you guys like this?" And maybe even the other side would say, "Wait a minute, here's a platform we have." Then they'd have to fight over our votes. But I do hear what you're saying. It's fun. It's funny. You kind of reminded me of my father because he definitely does not want a Kamala Harris presidency and is just doesn't want to see that. So I get it, but it's almost better for me that she strikes more fear and anger into the hearts of them because it frankly gives us more leverage. And I do agree with you. I think MGTOW really is the only sort of cohesive movement. I'll use that word loosely, cohesive, but it's the only thing with enough definition that seems to be having an actual impact. The self-improvement guys are more about just telling you how to reach these sort of ridiculous standards that we see out there, or they're more concerned with short-term things like just getting a woman into bed or something like that, and they're not really concerned with collective issues for men. Same with the pickup artists and these kinds of things. So I do appreciate you humoring that idea. It is something I hope gets discussed more in the space because I think again a boycott and just like boycotting marriage is the thing that is getting their attention somewhat.
Mhm.
It, if you have time or if you don't mind, I do got just a couple viewer questions that kind of sent them into me. If you don't mind, maybe I can ask them. Unless there's anything else that you'd like to say or present here prior to the
No,
question.
no, I'm happy
Perfect.
to.
This one is from Klaus, and he said he wanted me to ask you what is the best way to deal with false accusations, especially hard to prove ones like emotional and sexual abuse. And he also asked, as a part two, what do you think a fair and balanced marriage contract looks like?
Okay, well, the first question, I mean, righteous indignation is the first way. I knew a one man who had some success in demanding that he be charged, criminally charged. When the specter came up of a domestic violence accusation, he demanded that he be criminally charged with violent assault so that he would have due process protections. He would be charged, there would be a trial, presumably there'd be a jury. He would have his constitutional rights because he knew that at least that way he had a chance of constitutional rights, whereas he didn't have any if it's merely a domestic violence accusation that doesn't really, it's the purpose of those accusations is to just get the man out of the house, develop a fait accompli so that he's gone and he's lost custody basically. Whereas if he's criminally charged with in a criminal court, then presumably he will get a chance to clear his name and to get constitutional protections. So you might try that. Apparently it worked for this one man. I didn't follow it and I don't know who else has tried it, but I think that would be a nice ploy because it would, if nothing else, it would highlight, um, you know, the irony and the injustice that's going on here in these phony accusations that everybody knows is phony because they're not
Mhm.
putting men away for years for violent assault
Yeah.
because everyone knows there isn't any violent assault. The only purpose is to get them out of the house so they lose custody. Um, as for the other question about what is a contract,
I'm sorry. It was what do you think a fair and balanced marriage contract looks like? So he's asking like, what do you think is a fair marriage terms, basically?
well, I think basically, I think the traditional terms of marriage are basically fair. I mean, they do vary somewhat by locality, But basically, the important thing is that marriage needs to confer parental rights. You have to, you have a legally binding contract, which and a legally inviolable relationship with any children that are produced by that union. And within that, I mean, I suppose if there's some, terms by which the contract could be abrogated, like infidelity or desertion. I mean, those vary among locality. I'm not sure that's the most important thing. As long as people know under what circumstances that contract can be violated. In other words, if they commit a felony, if they desert the household, if they commit adultery, then their marriage contract can be abrogated and they will lose their parental rights. As long as they know in advance, those are the terms of it. I think the actual terms are not important. What's unjust, the most unjust thing is just the fact that you could just make it up as you go along. But men think they have a legally binding contract, and it's basically a fraudulent contract that isn't worth the paper it's written on.
That's a fantastic point. I'll just ask maybe two more questions. I know we're kind of pushing on time here. This one's from Dan the Man, and he says, he basically states that tradcon women, traditional conservatives, are not traditional, but more so cosplaying as a feminist or an undercover feminist. And he wants me to ask you how to deal with tradcon women.
It depends on what you're dealing with them in what way. I mean, if you're thinking of marrying one, then you need to hold her. I mean, there is, I suppose, in some states, there's still the concept of covenant marriage. I don't know if anybody still uses it anymore, if it's legally binding. I mean, this came up a few years ago in Louisiana, especially about, covenant marriage, which was a much more restrictive form of marriage contract, which you could opt for. It wasn't terribly successful. I don't know if it still exists or if it's possible or if it's enforceable or if it's enforced. I just don't know. As far as tradcom women, I wouldn't, frankly, in other respects, I just don't believe them. I think they talk about traditional values, but unless they believe in the inviolability of the marriage contract and the absolute inviolability of father's the rights of a married father, then they're just I find that many of them simply want their own piece of turf. They want whatever church or conservative organization or whatever they want to be queen in that. I'm sure there's exceptions. I know there's exceptions, but
perfect. And just I'll ask one more question. This one's from Peter. He says, how important is it for the culture to be in alignment for legal change to stick? So it's kind of does politics or influence culture? Or does culture influence that? So I think what he's saying is basically that, even if you manage to get the legal change, if the culture doesn't match it, there might be so many caveats in it that it just makes it useless.
I tend to feel the opposite, actually, because there's an awful lot of nothing that is done in the name of culture. Talking about changing the culture it becomes a big excuse for doing nothing. I mean, nobody talks about changing the culture before we can change abortion laws. People just want to change the abortion laws, and then the culture will fall into line. And I think that's the case. I mean, there's certain things in the law that are simply unacceptable. I mean, false accusations of crime are simply unacceptable. Contracts that are not enforced is unacceptable. No-fault justice is unacceptable. Violating the Bill of Rights, which these courts do all the time, is simply unacceptable. I mean, these are laws that we've all agreed to and consented to. We've all had a role in making them and agreeing to them and enforcing them. They need to be enforced. And you don't have to change the culture before you can enforce the presumption of innocence or before you can protect an innocent person from a false criminal accusation. That doesn't require changing the culture. That requires exercising a certain amount of courage to enforce the law as it's written, which was passed when the culture was stronger. So I think this culture thing becomes an excuse for doing nothing.
Okay. Well, that's fantastic answers. I do appreciate that. And I think we'll call a close here. I do want to draw attention just one more time to your latest book, Who Lost America? Why the United States Went Communist, in quotes, and what to do about it. I will make sure that's linked down here in the description. Please check out his book and please support Stephen Baskerville. Follow him on Twitter. This is possibly the only academic we have currently trying to help men, at least that I've seen, so far, and that is very rare indeed. So I want to thank you, Doctor. And if there's anything else you'd like to say, please go ahead and feel free to say it.
Thank you. This is very important what you're doing. The alternative media is the most powerful weapon we have. So God bless you.